Welcome to YogiViews, where my guest is yoga itself, through interviewing those who practice it, teach it, sell it, or simply love it. I am Antonio Saucis. Yoga's entry into North American society is marked by the speech that Swami Vivekananda gave at the Parliament of World's Religions, hosted in Chicago in 1893, where he represented Hinduism. In his speech, he quoted two passages from the Bhagavad Gita, one of the most influential texts in yoga that expresses some of the core spiritual concepts of the discipline. As yoga spread from then on, it became a popular physical activity that lost some of the mental and spiritual aspects. Today, some yoga teachers and scholars are invested in bringing the wholeness of yoga back into the equation, initiating a new chapter in yoga's history in the West. I have with me today someone who has studied the history and is writing a book on the topic, Eric Shaw. Welcome, Eric.
It's good to be here, Antonio.
Eric Shaw is a lifelong athlete, yogi, and the creator of Prasana yoga, a form of yoga that blends flowing movement with static alignment, rooted deeply and consciously in the ancient philosophy of yoga. He shares his style of asana and lecturing with dynamic multimedia presentations worldwide. His latest project is a book on the history of yoga in the US entitled Sweet Limits, Yoga's American History. It reviews yoga's key events and personalities before Swami Vivekananda's USA teaching in 1893 and then tracks the courtship and marriage of yoga with American culture into the present day. Eric, it's a pleasure to have you. Thanks for joining us. And I want to ask you one question that most people want to know about, and that is, how did your personal yoga path start, your yoga experience?
Well, I had a life as a triathlete for about 6 years, and in the last 6 months or a year of my practice, I had this little voice talking to me in my head that said, you should do yoga. And I ignored the voice for a number of months, and then I got a book called Yoga for Athletes by this coach of a gymnastic team, I think, in one of the Balkan countries. But anyway, it's a great book, and I started practicing every day and taking classes 3 times a week. I'm like that. I'm a gestalt guy. When I do something, I do it completely, and I love routines. So I started practicing yoga every day, and within 6 months, I'd given up my triathlete career and had focused on yoga.
Now, Eric, let's move into yoga's history, because you are writing a book on the topic, and it's quite interesting how yoga had spread in the West, and particularly in the United States. Could you give us a summary of yoga's history here?
Oh yeah, how long do you want me to talk?
At will.
Well, what excites me is the modern history. And I could talk all day about the ancient history and the modern history. But as you presented in your intro, we kind of mark the beginning of the modern history with the address in 1893 of Swami Vivekananda to the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago. And the reason that is the marker for that shift from pre-modern to modern, in my definition, is that he took a practice which had been held under the cover of what's called Guru Diksha, of the space of the guru-disciple relationship, and Hatha Yoga, the yoga of the body, was only offered with that kind of commitment, with that kind of social contract established in India between a teacher and whoever chose to follow them. But what Vivekananda did, and it should be known that he didn't actually teach Hatha Yoga, he didn't actually teach physical yoga, but he did teach meditation, and he did teach pranayama, and he did teach sitting posture. But he offered yoga, he called it Raja Yoga, the yoga of the Yoga Sutras, the yoga of the mind. He offered yoga in classes. like we offer yoga now. So he wasn't demanding that you come through the door of yoga in any kind of special way. You come to his classes. I mean, I don't know if he had, people make donations or not. He did do talks for cost. I don't know what his classes were like as far as cost goes. But you come into his class, and he teaches you yoga, just like he would teach you geography or gardening, or auto repair. He had autos then. They were just beginning to have them, So yoga becomes a subject in the modern period. And it becomes no longer an esoteric practice, what is something that is secret and hidden and only for initiates and only conveyed with a certain transmission of power, of personal power that comes from an exclusive bond. Because that's what happens. That's why the guru-disciple relationship is powerful. Is there's something that is allowed to happen in that intimate context which cannot happen in a non-intimate context. There's a transmission that goes on that is deeper and more profound. So in this exterior context, yoga is lightened. And we know that. It's reduced down to more particulars, more simplistic terms. It's something that becomes more like orthodox religion as we know it, something that is a more exteriorized practice, something that is shown, something that is exhibited, something that other people can watch at will. Yeah. So it's not something that is exclusively devoted to building internal power. Not exclusively. It still has those elements. And as yoga progresses, so getting back to facts, it progresses into Hatha Yoga through the line of Vivekananda when he brings Abhidananda over in 1896. So he's been here for 3 years. He leaves in 1897. But the last year he's here, he brings over his brother monk from the Ramakrishna order, Abhidananda. And Abhidananda starts teaching Hatha Yoga. And what we need to understand is that Hatha Yoga was not positive in those days. Hatha Yoga was a negative thing. Hatha Yoga was something that these dirty yogis in the street in India were doing, these crazy contortions. I mean, if you try and reframe this practice that we do now that is elegant and beautiful, and that everybody is sort of competing to attain these wonderful, architectures of the body. But if you put it in the context of the 1890s, it's simply contortion. People don't know what yoga is, and they don't know what India is, and they don't know what Indian culture is. And they see these people who are outcasts. They are not members of the caste system. They are on the social boundaries, outside the social boundaries, doing these postures in the streets. It's not an attractive thing. So Abhidananda, but there is a spiritual element to it. I mean, the yogis were of a variable quality in India. They were more like magicians and shamans than they were like simply holy men. They were holy men for sure, and they were mostly men, who were devoted to the highest ideals and transforming themselves deeply and offering great boons to people. But there were also people who were doing Hatha Yoga practices purely for worldly power. So it has this variable quality. It is both good and it is bad. Yeah? So, but in the West, it had people had more of a negative understanding of it. So Abhidananda begins to teach yoga posture, and Vivekananda's followers protest. They're not happy with this. They think he's teaching, some kind of like weird medicine, some kind of weird practice. Not everybody, but some of them. And but nonetheless, it catches on. And by 1898, believe it or not, this is almost impossible to believe, but there's newspaper evidence for it. Yoga becomes a fad in New York City through Abhidananda's teaching. It's a fad. The upper classes are attracted to this yoga. These fashionable people are becoming attracted to yoga, and they're doing it in their living rooms, and it's something new and exciting for people to explore. So very, very early on, yoga's exoticism and perhaps its aesthetic appeal, the yoga of the body, starts to appeal to a certain class of people. We can backtrack a little bit, and we can introduce a guy by the name of Pierre Bernard, who begins studying with a single guru in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1888 at the age of 13. He's 13 years old, a Syrian tantric by the name of Sylvius Hamadi. Who knows how he got here, who knows why he is here, and who knows why he chose Pierre Bernard as his student, begins teaching this young boy tantric yoga practices. Tantric yoga practices. It's still Hatha Yoga, it's the yoga of the body, but he's giving this young man an exclusive connection in an esoteric tradition, not exoteric. He initiates him. He teaches him the true, the deeper work. He gives him a serious download of yogic understanding. And he goes on to teach yoga therapy in San Francisco in the 1890s. 1890s.
Yoga therapy.
Yoga therapy.
Huh.
He teaches hypnotism. He offers the skill of hypnotism to doctors, because this is a time when health issues are huge in the United States, and alternative therapies are still competing with allopathy. Now allopathy has the day, right? Exterior medical practices are the primary form of medicine. But in those days, you had homeopathy, you had osteopathy, you had nature cure, you had mind cure. All these things were competing for the public's attention. And Pierre Bernard becomes an expert in hypnotism that people were using actually for anesthesia. People were operating on people by hypnotizing them, disengaging them from their pain receptors, putting them into a kind of simulated coma. So he was good at this. And then he was also treating people with yoga therapy. And then he started to open yoga studios. Before the earthquake in 1906, he had a place called the Bhakante Academy, where he taught yoga practices, and he developed a kind of secret society. You know, we have to remember that these are the days when you had things like the Elks Club, and you had the Masons, and the Order of the Golden Dawn. All these secret societies were all the rage in American society. So he created the Tantric Order of America. And within this place where he initiated people in a Western esoteric style, in a Western occult style, he was able to teach deeper tantric practices. So here's these two streams that we have. We have Abhedananda's teaching, which becomes a public exoteric teaching, and we have this other stream, which is kind of undercover, that Pierre Bernard, who he wins the sobriquet from the press, they call him the Great Om, O-O-M, and he's actually reviled for that. He gets into a lot of trouble with the press and with the authorities for what he does. But he's teaching an esoteric practice and a tantric practice. What Abhedananda teaches is what's called classical yoga from the Yoga Sutras, a more orthodox practice. But he's teaching like the spooky stuff. He's teaching the deeper, miraculous type practices. And he becomes very successful, and he has his own history, which is very interesting, and he dies in 1952, I believe, at the age of 80. But he eventually builds an ashram in upstate New York, and he attracts celebrities, and he's like known throughout the United States. He becomes a successful businessman. He has this whole radical history with Hatha Yoga. But partly what Vivekananda does when he comes to teach yoga is he sets a template for other Indians to follow. He comes to America, and he's the conquering hero. He's the Swami in the turban. He's the exotic man who everybody wants to know his secret knowledge. Yeah? So other Indians, and you have to understand that they're educated Indians. They're Indians who speak English. They're Indians who understand the West. They're Indians who have enough perspective on their own society and the caste system that they can violate caste rules. Number of them come and teach, and you get these little seeds of yoga. Like you get Baba Premanand Bharati and at the same time, and you just stop me if I'm just going on too long.
Please.
At the same time, you get a bunch of Americans who get really excited. Which is a subtle concept. Before that, when they were trying to explain mind cure, because you had people like Phineas Quimby and the people who started Christian Science like Mary Baker Eddy, they were actually using yoga practices. They weren't calling it yoga, but they were using focus and concentration to change physical reality. They were doing it mainly to change their health, yeah. But they didn't have a conceptual framework that allowed them to fully understand it, because they were dealing with these clunky Newtonian concepts from Newtonian physics. So they said, oh, there's some kind of fluid that moves out of my mind, or there's some kind of way I affect this material called the ether in the universe. But when Vivekananda came and he explained prana, which was life energy, which he didn't call it vibration, but that was implied, that there's some kind of vibratory quality in the universe that I can affect through mental focus. They got a new tool in their toolkit, a new conceptual tool. And so this thing called New Thought, which we recognize today in forms like the movie The Secret, or The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale, or the writings about manifestation, by Esther Hicks and whatnot. That type of thought begins to percolate, and it accelerates from this information that comes from Vivekananda. So there's this period of about 15 years where yoga and New Thought are kind of synonymous, where these American authors are latching on to these concepts that Vivekananda brought and calling and actually justifying their mind cure practices by referencing Hindu philosophy. So that's another way, conceptually, philosophically, that yoga comes powerfully into the American frame. There's a movement from our side, people adapting the practices, and people having original kind of discoveries in a realm that is very much like yoga, and then starting to use yoga language to explain it, and they're propagating their ideas, and New Thought is becoming very powerful. It's becoming, this is the golden age in America, what they call the Gilded Age, and there's this huge focus on economic expansion, and people are trying like crazy to get ahead. Nothing's changed. But it was particularly intense in the 1890s. And so this becomes kind of the rage, and it's the beginning of this whole self-help tradition. Yeah? And it's informed by this dialogue with yoga. So you get a lot of these authors who are blending that stuff together. And some of them, like William Walker Atkinson, actually calls himself Yogi Ramacharaka. And he writes all of these books that if you go online, and I encourage viewers to do that, go online and type in Yogi Ramacharaka, and his titles are still bestsellers. His works are out of copyright, but hundreds of publishers in even different countries have picked up his books and republished them. Like the Hindu Science of Breath. Just type in Hindu Science of Breath and you'll find that book by him, published by about over 20 different authors. And they must be selling because you can't find anything cheaper than $7. I just checked this out the other day, so that's why I know it. So he was a very potent writer. He had a very deep understanding, and he was posing as an Indian, but somehow whatever download he had, whatever understanding he had, was potent enough for him to walk that line between this new American understanding and the ancient understanding of India. So this dialogue begins to deepen. It had started earlier in the 1800s, but it begins to deepen in the 1900s. You can't really say that yoga had won the day yet. It wasn't really looked at positively still. It was still something kind of arcane that people who had enough courage or enough cultural breadth that they could engage with it and use it. And at this point, you kind of have to jump to India, because what was happening in India was another investigation of Hatha Yoga that came from an excitement about indigenous forms of physical practice. Because there was a revolution in physical culture in India. People were wanting to build up their bodies because they wanted to fight the British. They said, the reason the British own us, the reason they rule our country is because we're weak.
We're weak.
How do we become manly? How do we become strong? Well, we can do it by British means. We can use their gymnastics and their wrestling, or we can do their weightlifting and whatnot. Or what do we do on our own? What are our practices? Well, we have wrestling, and we have pose work from wrestling, and exercise routines from wrestling, and we have these juggling balls and 9 pins and stuff that they work with. But they also had yoga. So they looked to the yoga. They saw the yogis in the street, and they go, can we make that into a physical culture practice? That was a question. I mean, it's kind of odd to think of that as a question, but at some point in history, that was a question. Can we codify that? Can we use that to build, not for a spiritual practice, not for a magical practice, but actually to build the body? And so you get these papers by people like Swami Vivekananda, who set up a research center in just outside of Pune, north of Mysore in the western side of the country, where he publishes this magazine called Yoga Mamamsa, which explores the scientific applications of yoga. But at that point, yoga was becoming exoteric in a different sense in India. Yeah? It was not coming in as a spiritual practice that was taught lightly, but it was a spiritual practice which is being taught specifically as a physical culture practice. So this is happening as early as the early 1900s, say 1903, 1904, with a guy named Rao, who starts these akharas, which are kind of like training centers for like possible soldiers, people who are going to subvert the British Raj. And then you start to get people who are starting physical culture centers, like Bishnu Ghosh, who was the teacher of Bikram Choudhury, who started Bikram Yoga. He opens a center in 1922 in Calcutta. And these guys, like K.V. Iyer, was also a huge bodybuilder, the most man with, he claimed to have a body that the gods covet. He was a beautiful bodybuilder in India. And these men, Anant Rao is another one, they start to blend yoga with bodybuilding explicitly to have a supple form, not just a hard form, but a supple form. So there's these different streams. There's a scientific approach, there's physical culture approaches, there's this approach that comes from the desire for a stronger nationalism in India. And then a key figure in India is a guy named King Wodir, who is the potentate of this small government. Yeah. But he's also a very wealthy man, and he's interested in physical culture. So he starts to support these yogis. And one of the yogis that he supports is Krishnamacharya. So most viewers will probably know Krishnamacharya. He was the teacher of B.K.S. Iyengar.
Patabi Joyce.
And Krishna Patabi Joyce. Yeah, right. So Krishnamacharya is supported, but he's in the context of experiment. He's been trained by a deep, deep yogi. Yeah, he studied with Brahmohan Brahmachari in the mountains of Tibet. He practiced with him for 7 years. He comes out of that setting in 1922, and he knows all the yoga postures. But he knew them even before. His father had taught him when he was 5 years old. So he's this amazing pundit. It's called a pundit. He knows all the shastras. He knows all the darshanas. He knows all the philosophies of India. He knows Ayurveda. He knows how to play the veena, the flute. He knows ritual. He knows how to do medicinal preparations. He's just this master of the whole Indian tradition. But his master has said, you will make your living by yoga. So he has this mission. He has all of these skills, but his master has given him a mission that he has to teach yoga. This is very interesting. It seems like there was this understanding in India that yoga had to come into the world, because we don't only see this with Krishnamacharya, we also see this with some other teachers. Shivananda did that with his disciples, with Vishnudevananda, with Satchitananda, with Satyananda. He says, you will teach yoga. You will go out and you will teach yoga. Yeah.
They did.
And they did, yes. They brought it to America.
Yes.
Right? In the late 1950s and mid-60s.
And to other parts of the world.
And to other parts of the world, that's true. Yeah, he sent his disciples out everywhere. Yeah. You also had this with Madhava Dasaji, who taught... comes to America in 1920, and he sets up the Yoga Institute in Bear Mountain, north of New York City. And he connects with all of these alternative health people. They become his sponsors, he hangs out for 4 years, and then he goes back to India. He never comes back to America because they changed the immigration laws while he's gone. But he starts a very significant institute there. So Madhava Dasaji was his guru, and he was Kuvalyananda's guru, and he had the same mission. He taught these guys yoga, and he encouraged them to go out and teach yoga therapy. He wanted them to create a medical practice out of yoga. So here's another stream. Yoga is coming in not as a spiritual practice, but as a medical practice. Yeah. We'd seen it before with Pierre Bernard, but he was kind of a lone ranger, kind of doing this on his own. And he had kind of a profit motive. He kind of had some mercenary intentions. But with Yogendra and Kuvayananda, there's a little bit more of a pure intent, and they're deputed by their guru to go out, and specifically in Yogendra's case, he actually kind of fought with his guru. He said, I want to be a householder yogi. I'm not going to be a celibate. I'm not going to be a monk. I'm not going to follow this path. I want a family. I want to live in the regular world. He was a very independent thinker. Yeah? And so there was this little tussle he had with his guru. Yeah? And out of that dialogue, this stronger movement towards bringing yoga in the world happened, because he situated himself in this world. Some government contracts, he was able to teach a lot of people yoga and cure a lot of people. So you have that medical movement that is happening in the 20s, and then in the 1930s, of course, King Woodyear, he sponsors Kuvayananda, he sponsors K.V. Iyer, he sponsors Anant Rao, he sponsors another guy named Sundaram, and these guys are all working with yoga and physical fitness. As I say, there's this experiment happening at this time. It's a very experimental period, and what Krishnamacharya does is he starts to work with a very athletic form, which he calls vinyasa. The movements through the form. He's also influenced by a guy named what's his name? The king of Aund, who is bringing Surya Namaskar into his kingdom. So we all know what Surya Namaskar is. We say it's a part of yoga, but Surya Namaskar was not a part of yoga there. His name and he teaches Surya Namaskar throughout his kingdom.
Surya Namaskar is the sun salutation.
The sun salutation, yeah, the linked movements, yeah. Mm-hmm. So this provides a template for Krishnamacharya, because he learns Surya Namaskar from K.V. Iyer, and K.V. Iyer is influenced by Bhavan Ropant. Yeah. So Surya Namaskar influences this approach to yoga, which is new, which is a moving yoga. And Krishnamacharya blends all of his practices together in this kind of mandala. This mala is like the mala is like the beads that the devotees wear. There's 108 beads, and so each movement is like one bead. That's what Pattabhi Jois will call it later. It's like a mala of movement. Yeah, there's a stop, but there's a continuation throughout all the stops. Yeah. So this is also a new form. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, it gets created in the 30s, but it doesn't come to America for another 40 years. It doesn't come until K. Pattabhi Jois is discovered by a group of Americans, by David Allen, David Allen, and a group of other Americans who travel to India and bring Ashtanga Yoga to Encinitas, California. And then they bring over K. Pattabhi Jois in 1974. Yeah.
Eric, I know that not only I am fascinated by this history that you're presenting to us, but at the same time I am interested in knowing some other things. So now that we are in the 70s, what happened after the 70s? How do we get to where we are now?
Well, like I said, you had this moving yoga come to America. I mean, you had Lilias Phalan, who was teaching this kind of simple yoga on TV, and you had Iyengar Yoga had come through his book in 1966, Light on Yoga. But then this dynamic form comes, which is Ashtanga Yoga. Yeah? And it's taught by David Williams and Doug Allen, and they bring it to Encinitas in a very dynamic way. And it starts to attract a more athletic element, because it's an athletic practice. You sweat, and it has this elegance. It moves. Yeah? So it has this appeal to America. America, we're a dynamic, we're a moving culture. And so it has a little bit more of a mass appeal. And it has, I think, more of appeal to the men. So more athletic yogis, more dynamic people are being drawn into the practice. And so yoga kind of gains some new momentum. And you have to also realize that this is the 70s, yeah? It's kind of the me decade. It's when people are doing a lot of inner exploration after the ya-ya energy of the 60s. People are going inward a little bit more. And they're starting to explore Eastern cults with a little more drama. This is also the period of cults when people are being programmed and deprogrammed. So there's this real attraction to mystical states, which is a little more serious. It's not just the teenagers and college students of the 60s. They've grown up, and to the extent that they're exploring Eastern practices, they're doing it with a greater intent, with more seriousness. So yoga starts to have an even stronger place in American society, and it offers a more of an athletic option. The 80s is a little bit of a regression. It's the moral majority period, the back to values period. People are having families, they're less interested in exterior pursuits. It's the Reagan era, and there's kind of a reset in American culture. We kind of look back to previous values, and yoga has a kind of a slowdown period. But in that period, it kind of percolates, and you start to find yoga a bit in health clubs and whatnot. In the 90s, there's a new acceleration because there's new wealth in the country. The internet explodes, Clinton has his presidency, and people are kind of open again and wanting to explore new forms of culture and new forms of practice. And that's when yoga really takes off. Because you start to have celebrity yoga teachers, famous people like Madonna start to get into yoga. Whenever you have someone like that, like the Beatles really accelerated in the 60s too when they started studying with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, that kind of becomes a node of cultural attraction. So you start to get superstar teachers and you start to get conventions of yoga. Unity in Yoga has its first yoga conference in the 90s. And you start to get like the work of Dean Ornish, which legitimizes yoga for the mainstream public. So all these things kind of are in a dance together.
And for the use of yoga in health.
In medical settings, It gains validity through empirical science, through Ornish's work. You know, he does the lifestyle heart trial. And then in 2000, it's just an acceleration of that. And in my own life, I mean, I became a yoga teacher in 2001. But I remember I was on an airplane in 2002, and two things happened on this one trip I was on. Not only did I watch a video on the airplane of some personal trainer teaching me yoga poses, which just blew me away, because at that point in my life, it was still like this alternative culture practice. It's like mainstream TV on a major airline, I'm seeing someone's teaching me yoga. And then when I got to the airport, on the cover of Vogue magazine, I saw a model in a yoga pose. It's like, it just blew me away. I remember I added 4 yoga classes to my schedule that week. I said, I got to handle this. Boom, it's coming. And so I feel like that really was another moment in yoga's history in 2002 where it made another leap forward. It really stepped strongly into the mainstream. And there's been a number of those re-accelerations, I feel like, in the last 10 years. It's just yoga is you're now seeing it in mainstream advertising. Obama does yoga in the White House Easter egg hunt. He pulls in all these big-name yoga teachers to teach yoga. It's talked about, everywhere. I mean, we live in California, a little bit of a bubble, but you see studios all over the country, and the publication numbers of Yoga Journal have gone through the roof. It's very much becoming a central part of American culture.
If people want to get in touch with you, how can they do so?
They can go to prasanayoga.com, prasanayoga.com, or they can find me, Eric Shaw, on Facebook. I connect with people through Facebook a lot. I'm not much of a Twitter guy, but those would be ways to find me.
Eric, it's been a pleasure. I thank you for what you shared here with us today, and for your personal contribution to the history of yoga, and your part in the modern part of it. And as I said before, I hope to have you again before your book is out, so you can tell us more about it. And thank you for being with us.
Good to be here, Antonio. Blessings to you.
Blessings.
I'm honored.
This was Eric Shaw, a lifelong athlete, yogi, and the creator of Prasana Yoga, a form of yoga that blends flowing movement with a static alignment, rooted deeply and consciously in the ancient philosophy of yoga. He shares his style of asana and lecturing with dynamic multimedia presentations on worldwide. His latest project is a book entitled Sweet Limits, Yoga's American History. It reviews yoga's key events and personalities before Swami Vivekananda's USA teaching in 1893, and then tracks the courtship and marriage of yoga with American culture into the present day. I hope you have enjoyed our show today, and if you want to let me know what you think, shoot me an email at antonio@yogiviews.com, and I hope to see you the next time.